to the main track and Scott Weiner's session. I would say Scott is a very, very good reason to join the group itself. Right? So, Scott, stage is yours. We are already recording.
Welcome, everyone. So we're going to talk to you today about something called Agile Skeptics or Agile Resistant Teams. The reason I'm doing this is that over the last few years, we've noticed there's this trend. There's two pieces to this. There are literally teams like the one I'm going to talk about in a true case study that really didn't want to do Agile at all. And I'm going to talk about how we evolve them into having an Agile mindset and actually really embracing it in a serious way. But even in teams that want to be Agile and want to use Agile approaches, there's still a lack of understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. And so they struggle unnecessarily. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm hoping you connect with that you've seen some of it, or you've experienced yourself, or you may be experiencing it right now. And so I'm going to talk about the approach we took. And I don't want to say that this is the only way or there's a best way to solve these. I'm going to show you the path we took to help this team. And I'm hoping that through that process and that you're going to see some things that are interesting to you. And then we can talk afterwards and answer questions. And even after the session, if you want to reach out, I'm happy to talk about it as well. So real quick about me and my company, Nuion. So Nuion is a strategic consulting company. Everyone in our organization is a CXO. We've all run companies. I've been a CEO, a CTO. And so when I first got into this about 8 or 10 years ago, I started as a fractional CTO. I would go into organizations and help them with their technology and their processes. And what we quickly found out was that the main problems people were having in these larger organizations was not technical. It was really the people problems and the communication and the organizational and structural problems. And so we started really focusing down on how we could help them with that. And we ended up moving into Agile as a way of addressing some of the things we were seeing. And through those processes, we ended up at one very large organization. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about this case study. So I'm going to tell you a little about the client, just to give you a background on the situation, what our role is, how we were brought in there. So we weren't brought in there to help an Agile resistant team. We were actually brought in there to build programs for this organization. And then a situation occurred and they asked us to help with a specific team. So the reason I like going down to one team is I think it's a lot easier to talk about some of these bigger issues when you pick one example. So this was a large financial services organization. They had about 1,200 Agile teams at the time. This was a couple of years back now, so they probably have many, many more than that now. They were growing rapidly. They had already been on like a 10-year Agile journey. So it's not like we're talking about an organization that's just starting to figure out Agile. This is a company that's been working on this for a long time. Some areas of the company were using SAFe as their methodology. Other parts of the organization were doing other things. So it was uneven, the way Agile was being implemented, and also the knowledge level across the company. They didn't have a good knowledge sharing process throughout the organization. They were very federated, meaning they had, each department or division or section had their own way of doing things. And there were some major, what I call anti-Agile practices, and later on I'll get into a few of them, but essentially practices that didn't support agility. That doesn't mean they're bad necessarily. It just means that they weren't going to help you become better at Agile. And so that's kind of the organization we were brought into. Now, we were brought into their continuous improvement group, and we were asked to specifically help with standing up new teams. They were creating teams left and right. Every few days or weeks, they're bringing in new teams. And they wanted a strategy to make these teams consistent in the way they formed so that they could get off the ground faster. They wanted to improve performance of the existing teams as well. So they wanted us to create improvement programs for performance management. And then they wanted to help with their cultural issues that they recognized that were getting in the way, and ultimately helping coach their leadership. So those are what we were brought in to do. And then something happened, which was there was a specific release train within the organization that was at high risk of failure. And there was a lot of concern about it because this was a high-profile team working on very important work. And so they asked us if we could kind of put what we were doing to the side and just dive in on this team and just really try to help save them. They said, can you fix them? And I want to stress something. Nuion, and me specifically, don't fix things. We We will identify issues. We will ask questions. We will coach to some degree. They do the fixing. That's not our job. And that was part of the learning for them, is that, part of this process is not telling people how to do their job. And you're going to hear that as a theme throughout this. So what the management really wanted was, because this team's visibility in the organization was increasing and its importance, they really wanted to make sure that this team could be measurable. They didn't trust the team. And when a management doesn't trust a team, it creates a non-virtuous cycle. I don't trust my team, so I'm going to measure them more. I'm going to ask for reports and meetings and justification for why they're doing things and rationale. I'm going to ask for all this information. That causes the team to behave in a way that doesn't help the team, but helps the management. And that usually leads to morale issues, which leads to productivity issues, which leads to more mistrust. So it's a non-virtuous cycle that they create. And this is a very typical pattern you'll see, especially in larger organizations, but honestly, any organization. So we had to break those patterns in order to give them what they really wanted. The other problem this particular team had with management is their actual manager of the organizational team was in a whole different part of the country. They were in the middle of the United States, and this country was on the coast. So they were literally 1,000 miles apart or more. So that was another big problem. This was also pre-COVID. So the manager, being remote and using Zoom or whatever meant that the manager was away from the team. Everyone wasn't on Zoom, just the manager. So that caused a lot of communication problems along the way. The team itself. So the team that we were introduced to had 15 people on it. So it was a little bit larger for what you would call for a Scrum team. But the good news is they weren't a Scrum team, so it didn't matter. They had multiple feeder teams, though. So although we were focused on this one bigger team, there were many teams around them that were interdependent: data science teams, product teams, different types of organizations, that DevOps teams, all these other teams that they relied on to do their job. So we had to work with all of those teams, not just the 15-person team we were told to focus on. They had experienced some what they called success without Agile practices. And this is what we were talking about earlier today. And so because of that, they had a certain level of confidence that they didn't need Agile. We've been successful. Well, what they called success wasn't really success. So we're going to talk about what that means. There was a mentality of my task. Everyone in the entire group, all 15 of them, had a philosophy of my task. You do your task, I do my task. We don't really interact with each other while we're doing our work. They're a very siloed mindset. This was not really a team. It was 15 individuals working on a project, but they weren't really helping each other, not in any serious way. It's not that they wouldn't help each other. They just didn't think that way. There were definitely some morale issues that we had to deal with. One of the reasons for this is that they had built a product that they were very proud of, and the company took it away from them and brought it to another part of the company. And they felt demoralized because they wanted to maintain that product because they really liked that product. Funny thing about that product, it had no customer. Nobody actually wanted the product. They just built it. So, that's what I'm trying to say, is that their version of success really isn't the definition of success from a business perspective. Really what they were was a research team, an R&D team that was moving to production with something important for the first time ever. So even though they'd been around a long time, done a lot of work, they actually had never put anything into production. And so they didn't have that muscle. And that's why they thought they could get away with not having some of these practices and be fine. One last piece of issue for the team was that the management wanted them to break up into smaller teams. The management believed that they should be Scrum teams and they should have 5 to 7 people in a team, and they wanted them to break up. The management thought they were doing them a favor by saying, you figure out how to break up. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to let you self-organize. Sounds great, except that without direction and purpose and process, self-organized really looks more like chaos. What they ended up doing is just staying as 15-person team, but calling themselves Team A and Team B. So they actually didn't change anything about the way they worked, but when they talked to their manager, they talked as if they were on Team A or Team B. So there was a disconnect between what they told their manager and what they actually did. This is what happens when management builds processes and metrics for the team, rather than the team defining what they need to be successful. So we had to deal with all of this. The good news was the team was co-located. So they were all working together in the same room, and that was good for communication. That helped. Unfortunately, the tech lead of the team was also newly promoted to people manager. So this company had a habit of doing this typical thing of saying, you're really good at technology, let's make you a manager. I don't think he really wanted to be a manager. He had no training in being a manager. I think he just liked getting more money, and the promotion gave him more money. I don't think he really wanted to be in the management role. And that showed in a lot of the people issues we ran into. The Scrum Master had no formal training. He may have had certification, I think, but really had no formal training in being a Scrum Master, no experience on a successful Scrum team. So although he was a Scrum Master, they weren't a Scrum team, and he didn't do anything to make that better. He acted basically like the team's administrator, doing odd jobs for the team and running the meetings and so on. But his running the meetings meant doing all of the grunt work necessary so the team didn't have to do any typing or own any of the work they did in their meetings. The product owner, brand new to product ownership, had no experience, had gone through training, but that was it. He didn't want to be a product owner. He wanted to be a product manager. And he didn't really understand the distinction at first, but as he started to figure it out, he really didn't like being a product owner, which caused a whole other set of issues for us. So I'm painting a picture of a team with a lot of issues, and you may have seen some of these issues, and some of them you may not have. And so it sounds kind of dire. It sounds kind of like, boy, they're on a bad path. Well, this is just to summarize all the challenges, and then we'll get to the good stuff. There was increasing pressure on this team to deliver, and they didn't have the muscle to deliver. They had never done it before, really. So this was all new and scary, creating a lot of safety issues. They had no methodology to speak of other than code and fix. They essentially, someone complained about something and they fixed it. It was kind of their model. They had a huge distrust of Agile processes because each of them independently had worked in other teams where Agile didn't work well. They didn't have good processes in place. And so their view of Agile was very negative, very, very negative. And because of that, I actually learned to stop using Agile terminology when I talk and just talk about outcomes. And by changing my language, I got rid of that level of resistance. The leaders in this team itself, were driving everything, telling people how to do their job, what to do, criticizing everything that was said. And what that does, whenever you have someone who has a power dynamic in a team like that, is it makes everyone else turn into order takers. Whenever I go into a new team, the first thing I listen for is, are people saying, what do you want me to do? Or are they saying, here's what I think we should do? Which one do you hear more of? When I hear people saying, what do you want me to do? I know that they're beaten down. They're order takers. They're basically saying, I give up responsibility and accountability. I'll do whatever you want. Just tell me so I don't have to fight with you. And that mentality always sets in when there's someone with a stronger personality in the room that doesn't have some kind of counterbalance to them. So we had to deal with power dynamics as well. And we did. They didn't really have a backlog. They had no priorities. The backlog was just a list of stuff. So when they worked on something, they had no idea if they were delivering value or not. One of the habits I got into on a regular basis is I would walk up behind them while they were working during the day, and I would say, how's it going? And they'd say, great, or not good, or whatever they said. My next question would be, how do you know? And 99% of the time, the answer would be, I got my task done, or I didn't get my task done. And it was all about tasks. And so my last question to them would be, how do you know that task is valuable? And not once could they answer that question. They were all acting on autopilot. They were just doing work. They had no connection to the work. And so that was another issue we had to deal with. They also had almost no customer engagement. They really couldn't tell you who their customer was. They had no sense of personas. They had no sense of who they were really building the software for. And that led to a whole slew of problems we're not even going to have time to get into. And there was very little accountability or transparency because they didn't document anything. There was no Scrum board or Kanban board. There was no sense of here's what we're going to commit to, here's what we're going to deliver. There was none of that. So if they got something done, great. If they didn't, they had 15 excuses why. And there was really no accountability. Work that didn't get done just bled into the next week. It didn't matter. The other problem they had was 50% of their team was new hires because they have a rotation model in that company, not just this team, where every 3 months, I think it was every 3 months, might have been 6, but I think it might have been 6 months, but I think it was 3. People that are new to the company would come onto a team to get experience, and then they rotate off to go to another team to get experience. So there was no continuity, no ability to create a high-performing organization within that team. There was just no way to do it. So all of these challenges. And finally, the team split was causing a lot of morale issues because they didn't want to. Okay. So now I've given you the lay of the land. I walk in, this is what we see. So what are we going to do about it? This is the strategy we took, and there's several reasons for it. And this is generically our strategy, generally when we go into a company, with a few modifications for this culture. Number one is build trust. My job is to build trust with an organization as fast as humanly possible. I've gotten pretty good at it. I usually can build trust in a matter of hours or days, not weeks or months. We've come up with many, many techniques that work very well to build trust. And the level of trust I'm talking about, you'll hear it a little bit in this talk, but it's intense. They truly trust us, and we truly respect them through this process that we do. Trust is built very simply by listening hard, not telling them what to do, focusing on their concerns and their goals. Our goal is to empower them. And I just want to stress that empowerment is something that we don't actually give them. We don't give them power. They have the power. What we're really doing is letting them know they have the power. So we're just supporting them and not telling them what to do. And so by helping them understand their power to get things done, they take more responsibility over time. And that's kind of part of our job. And by doing that, by not pushing them in a certain direction, that also helps build trust. No training. This company tended to think of training as a waste of time. I don't think that, but this is the situation we were in. So we knew that in order to be successful in this culture, we had to do this without training. The reason they felt training was a waste of time was twofold. One, the managers would let people go to training, but they wouldn't allow them to have any time for the training, meaning that they still had to get their work done. So everyone who came to training felt like training was getting in their way. And so we became the enemy if we did training. And so we realized that doing any formalized training process was just going to frustrate people and put a wall between us and them. And we wanted to be what we call on the same side of the table with them, so that we were working together. And that wasn't going to work if we were looked at as impediments to them getting their job done. So we knew anything we did to help them had to be done in the context of while they're doing their real work. We couldn't take them out into a classroom or any other artificial environment. We had to work within their environment. Don't impose a method. This is part of our methodology. We don't go in and say to someone, oh, you should be a Scrum team, or you should be a Kanban team, or you should be whatever. We don't do that ever, for a couple of reasons. One is, when you tell someone how to do work, then you are now responsible, they are not. And we don't want to be in that position. So we need them to own it. And the only way to get them to own it is for them to come to realization they need it. And so what our job is make them thirsty. Our job is not to make them drink. Focus on why and a small set of goals. One of the biggest problems is that organizations and teams like this are so focused on the what. What am I doing? What tasks do I have in front of me? They spend so little time on why am I doing it. And that's why when I walk up to people and say, how do you know what you're doing is valuable? They can't answer, because they don't think about why. So we spent all of our energy on why. Why are you doing what you're doing? What are you trying to accomplish? What's your goal? And then what we do is we try to come up with a couple of very tiny goals, very, very small goals. And the reason for that is we're going to help them achieve those small goals quickly, like in days or weeks. And by achieving those small goals quickly, they build their confidence, and it also helps them build their trust in us. So small set of goals and achieve them as rapidly as possible. But the important point is they need to understand why those goals matter. If they don't, it's not worth it. It won't work. And finally, the last part of our strategy, retrospectives. Retrospectives, in my opinion, is an engine for change. Without a retrospective of some sort, and it doesn't have to be a Scrum kind of formal retrospective, but without some kind of reflection on what do we have, what's working, what's not working, what are we going to do about it? Without that conversation on a regular basis, you have no mechanism to change. Change then becomes very erratic and sparse. So what we wanted to do was insist on this. It's the only thing we insist on, nothing else. It's the only thing we say you must have. We won't work with you if you won't do this. It's the only thing. We don't mandate anything else. We do tell them why. We do explain why. We make sure that they all appreciate why. But even if they don't like it, this is the one thing we're like, look, we can't work with you if you're not going to try this. And the good news is they had no problem with it. They fell in love with it, actually. They love the process. So we run a very tight retrospective process that is really designed to support them and not us. So it helps them. You'll see this a little bit in the slides. Okay, So here's our approach. Step number one, model the retrospective. So day one, I'm introduced to the team. There's 15 people lined up in front of me. I come in the room. I'm the stranger in the room. I have to build trust with them very rapidly. That's my job. The way we do it is we first introduce ourselves. They introduce themselves. And then I ask them a very simple question. I asked them, I said, if I can help you fix 3 things about your team right now, what would they be? And I let that sit in the air for a few seconds. Silence is a tool. We use a lot of silence in our processes. So we try to be quiet, let them do the thinking and talking. And then what I did is I went around and just handed out, without saying a word, handed out sticky notes to everybody and pens. And then I pointed at the board. And then I just stepped back and I stopped talking. And that was it. Over the next, I think, 15 minutes, I don't remember exactly, they went from confused to a little bit stressed because they realized I wasn't going to do it for them. I wasn't going to write on the board. I wasn't going to prompt them. I wasn't going to direct them in what to do. I got out of the way. And they slowly organized. They talked. They wrote things on the stickies. They started putting stickies on the board. Once they started putting enough stickies on the board, and again, I didn't tell them they had to do that. I started asking them about the idea of affinity. And they started just grouping all of the stickies into groups. And before you knew it, there were 5 groups. Basically, there were 5 problems that the team had, 15 people had come up with that they all agreed on. And so then I asked them to prioritize, and they prioritized the list. They went through that. They created their own prioritization process. I didn't tell them how to do it. And now we had our goals. We had our 3 small goals. And so now I made the commitment to them. I'm going to help them get to those goals. So now I was starting to build trust because now they were starting to say, oh, well, we're skeptical, but if he can deliver on this, that's interesting. And so that's where we started. And so now I had my mission. And that was great. But there's one other part to the retro in the mission, the other side of the coin. I had to meet with the management and align the management with what I was doing. Because if I don't do that, I can't do what I really wanted to do, which is create a safe space for the team. See, I said before, if management is concerned about the team, if the management doesn't feel safe, then they question the team and they question what the team's doing. And ultimately, they're going to question what I'm doing since I'm kind of running the show here with this process. So I went to the management. I said, what are your 3 goals? And they told me what their goals were, business goals. And then I talked about what I was doing with the team, and I aligned what I was doing with what they wanted. And I said to them, we're going to meet every week. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to show you what we've accomplished against your 3 goals. I'm going to show you how what we're doing is helping us get to your goals. And we're going to make mistakes. And you're going to have to be okay with that. So I set expectations. And what I ultimately did is create trust with the management. So now I have trust of the team at some level. I'm not saying they completely trusted me yet. And I have trust of the management at some level. And that created space. And my job over the next few months was to continually create more and more space for the teams to experiment and try things. That was my job. So it became pretty clear what I had to do. Step number 2, if I'm really going to create trust and I'm really going to create alignment in a team, I have to get connected to each individual. I can't just work at scale in a massive way. I have to touch people. And so I started doing these one-on-ones. Now they were informal. I didn't create a process. We didn't have like regularly scheduled meetings. I would just walk up to someone and say, hey, do you got a few minutes? And we would go and just sit down and chat. It was never formal. It was just a way to connect. And what I was doing during those one-on-ones were these 4 things. Number 1, build trust using the triad of empathy. So I would show them that I could understand their perspective. I would emotionally connect to them and show them that I could see what they were feeling. Not that I would validate their feelings. I wouldn't necessarily say, I feel the same way. I wouldn't tell them about my story. It wasn't about me. But I made it clear to them that I validated their feelings, that they were valid. And ultimately, being empathic, I would use observations and talk to them about what I saw. And 99% of the time, maybe 100%, they would act like I was reading their minds. How could you know that? Well, here's the secret. When you've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of teams, you start to see a few patterns. And so the things they were experiencing, I had seen before. And so it made it easier for me to be empathic. But I got to tell you that anybody can do this using good observation skills. but it's an important piece of this. If you can't connect with them and show them that you really see them, then it's hard for them to trust you. And so that helps a lot. There are other techniques, but empathy is a big part of it. The second piece is I need them to be aligned with a larger purpose. I can't have them thinking their only job is to get promoted or to get tasks done. I need them to be connected to something larger than themselves, because if they're not motivated to work on something larger than themselves, then they'll never have the level of motivation I need them to have, because what I really needed them to do is change. And change isn't going to happen if they don't feel inspired. And so I had to help inspire them. Inspiring people is part of great leadership, in my opinion. Motivating people through inspiration is one of the greatest gifts you can give someone. And so I try to give that every day. I will tell you, it's really interesting. I have one of the team members came up to me early on, and he told me that he was thinking of resigning. And so I pulled him in another room and I asked him, why do you want to resign? And he said, well, all I do all day is move data from one database to another. And I said to him, and just so you understand, he is a very accomplished, young, but very accomplished machine learning expert. And what he does is build very complex algorithms. And ultimately, yes, those algorithms do move data from one place to another, but that's not really what he's doing. He knows that. But this is how he was feeling. And so what I said to him was, as a small business owner, you've created algorithms that make it easier for me to work with your financial organization and get more liquidity. And I'm able to turn that into more jobs and hire people and give them better jobs. And because I can give these people better jobs, their families have better lives. And there are millions of people like me out there that you're helping every day. This is what I told him. As I'm telling him this story and laying it out for him, he's sitting up straighter. He's breathing differently. Big smile beaming across his face. He went from being depressed to this really proud, happy guy in minutes or seconds. It was actually probably about a minute. And then he says to me, why don't they talk to me like this all the time? And all I could think was, I don't know. Why don't they? Because that's what leadership really looks like. It looks like a connection between you as an individual to the larger purpose. And when you have that, you have everything. That person is still there, by the way. He didn't leave. And finally, listening. If I'm not listening, I'm really not going to be able to help them. So a lot of what I try to do is be silent. I'll ask questions. I'll show curiosity, definitely respect. I'll question them a little bit, but mainly I want to listen. And then when they're done talking, I will reflect and show them that I do have a sense of what they're saying and that I heard them. And now we have a connection. And that connection is going to be invaluable in the next step. Because once I have that connection with them, I can start to rely on their trust of me to take a few risks, because I need them to take risks. So step number 3, now that we have kind of the idea of a retrospective and we have some trust starting to build and form in the team, and this is about a matter of days, by the way, just so you know, time-wise, we're now 2, 3, maybe 2 or 3 weeks in tops, less than that probably. We install a strong retrospective culture. What's the difference? The difference is that retrospectives start to form and run without me. They're starting to understand the value of retrospectives and how to run them effectively. They start to think about things like, what is our current state? What are our challenges? What do our stakeholders really want? They start thinking about stakeholders. Notice at this point, we have no Scrum process. We have no Agile process at this point. It's just focusing on getting the retrospective going, and some of those small goals that they wanted, I'm working on in the background with them. The small goals, by the way, were things like, they literally were small, like we're spread out, we're not really near each other, our offices aren't next to each other, we love to have offices next to each other, so we made that happen. That's an example, and they were just thrilled with that. The other part is, now that they're starting to get this retrospective process going, they're also starting to focus on problem solving. So first was, can we identify the information we need to decide how we're doing and where we're trying to go? And now that we kind of have a sense of where we want to go, what are our solutions look like? And so we started doing problem solving techniques, root cause analysis, things like that. And they started developing really strong skills in problem solving as a team, collaboratively. And the final piece that was the most difficult of problem solving was not the coming up with solutions part. It was making a decision. They were scared. They were scared of making mistakes. They were scared of losing promotions. They were scared of their management being mad at them if they made a mistake. They had a lot of safety issues. And so that took a little time to work through and build that trust up with them. It took me communication with their management, communication with them, but we did get there. It took a month. It did take a good month to get there, but we did. And at that point, they started making decisions. So their retrospectives now were valuable. I had created an engine of change. Now I could do anything with them because they knew how to look at things, solve for things, and make a decision and act on things. This was huge. This was what we really needed to be successful. So I created that engine of change. The last piece of this part of the approach, they've got to be able to measure. Now, here's the thing about measurement. I'm not going to have enough time to get into this in the level of detail I'd like to. I could do a whole nother session maybe on just this piece. Teams that measure what they believe is important will succeed over teams that are working on metrics that they don't believe in. Perfect example of this is I had one team that the manager said to me, I'm going to give everyone a bonus if they increase their velocity. Now, velocity doesn't go up or down because people aren't working hard enough most of the time. Most of the time, velocity is not going up or down because of environmental problems, organizational issues, impediments, meetings, things that get in the way of the developer doing their work. It's usually not because they're not working hard enough. And in fact, there's studies that show that, if you start giving people money for things like that, they tend to do worse, not better. So that's a whole other issue. I told this particular manager, what you just did is create a lot of 20-point stories. He didn't understand. Do you understand? You say to someone, I'll give you $1,000 if you increase your velocity. And their reaction to that is to have stories that are larger. That's what happens. Why does that happen? Because if you don't believe in a metric, what you're going to do is game the system. You're going to find ways to meet your manager's expectations, even if you don't believe it or understand the value of it. And so that leads to bad behaviors. So my goal with them with metrics was, what metrics do you care about, team? What do you think will drive your performance and improve you in the areas that you've identified? I pointed out, not areas that your management pointed out. What areas do you believe you need to get better in? And what do you need to measure to affect change in those areas? And getting them to get into that mentality was actually very difficult. There was a lot of fear around, well, but our management wants to know our cycle time. And so I asked them, I said, do you care about cycle time? Does that have any effect on your performance? Well, not really. It's not going to change the way we do QA. It's not going to change how fast we code. It's not going to change anything that's getting in our way right now. So we said, okay, throw that one out. But our management wants it. Let me worry about that. Work on the stuff you want. I'll worry about management. And so in my management conversations, I talked about my goal. I said, look, I know you guys want cycle time and I know why, but let me have the space to work with these people and not have them focus on things they don't care about until I can help them understand why they should care. So now we have a retrospective process, a way of measuring what matters for the team. So the team's motivated by the metrics. They actually affect them. They actually care about their metrics. They were measuring things like number of bugs, amount of time spent in meetings was something they measured. They wanted to spend less time in meetings. Okay, fine. But the team was completely against structure. They didn't want, I brought up the idea of some structural changes and they just were recoiled. And so I just backed off immediately. So instead, what I did is I asked them to solve problems. They said, what's your first problem? What problem do you have? They said, well, we're realizing day to day, we really don't know what each other's doing. There's 15 of us and we talk around each other and we're not really sure of what people are working on. And I said, well, what do you want to do about it? And they invented their own version of the stand-up. I didn't do it. We never used the word stand-up, by the way. I think we called it a status update. But their stand-up was basically a stand-up the way you would expect it to be. The only contribution I made to it is I suggested they keep it short. And they agreed to keep it under 15 minutes if they could. I didn't bring up 15 minutes, by the way. That was their idea. And so they created a stand-up. And it pretty much looked like what you'd expect a stand-up to look like, more or less. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. It was a good start. Next thing is they recognized that they weren't getting feedback from stakeholders. They never really talked to a customer. Boy, I wish we could talk to a customer. And before you knew it, they invented their own sprint review. Didn't look like sprint reviews the way I do them, but that doesn't matter. I asked them a few questions, like what would you show in a sprint review? What do you think your stakeholders would like to see? What kind of feedback do you want to get from them? And then I made it happen. I made sure that there were stakeholders showing up to these sprint reviews. And once we had people showing up to the sprint reviews, it was fantastic. The dialogue was great. Their morale went up. They were enthusiastic, hearing real customers talk about the product. It changed the whole dynamic. Well, Now that they were getting feedback, what they started to connect the dots on was, hey, if we get information from our reviews, we could feed that into our retrospective. So why don't we have the retrospective after the review? And that way we can learn from it. Okay. They did this. That's my point. I didn't tell them any of this. It was becoming clear to them at that point when that started to roll. This was about month 2, by the way. It was becoming clear to them that they needed some way to track what they were working on and provide transparency. See, here's what's happening. They're starting to feel more comfortable and confident, and their safety is going up. Their feeling of safety is going up. They believe in what they're doing more and more, and that they're doing the right things. And because of that, they were more comfortable sharing what they were doing with other people. They weren't as afraid of being held to accountability anymore. It was starting to be okay to be accountable for their work. And because of that, they had been using Jira all along as a task list, not as a Kanban board or Scrum board, but just as a list of tasks to do. So they were comfortable with the idea of Jira. And what they realized is the benefit of having Jira, because they already had it, is that there were a lot of people who were interested in where they were and what they were doing, and they were getting tired of having to update them. So they said, hey, if we just put it on the Jira board, they can go look for themselves and don't have to bother us. So their motivation for using a Scrum board was not because they wanted to do Scrum or have a Kanban process. It was because they didn't want to bother having to tell everyone what they were doing. They wanted transparency. They wanted one truth. And so they started implementing Jira. I helped them, and we built out the Jira board, and they started using it, and it was fine. And then this amazing thing happened. They started swarming. It was incredible to watch. You got to understand, when I got into this team, it was a team of people who absolutely did their own thing in their own little silos, sitting right next to each other and never talking about the work. They all did their own work. And all of a sudden, they could see on this board what was at the top of their priority list, and they could see when people were stuck, and they could say, can I help you? And they would swarm. Swarming behavior, the idea of multiple people trying to jump on a problem and get it through the process, focusing on finishing things rather than starting things, doesn't emerge until people feel safe. Human beings, when they feel threatened, go into a fight or flight mode. They say, what's in it for me? What about my promotion? What makes me look good? But as soon as they start to feel safe, they want to collaborate and help and be more helpful. People who help in a collaborative feel safe, secure, confident. Swarming behaviors form for that reason alone. It was amazing to watch. It was like magic. That's how it felt. So now that they have the Scrum board running, they started realizing that, hey, it would be great if we actually figured out some of this work ahead of time, so we weren't always kind of being surprised by the next thing on the board. We actually had a process. So they invented their own version of sprint planning. Again, didn't look like sprint planning like you and I probably know it, but it was basically a beginning of the sprint model where they would sit down and they would think about the work they were going to work on, and they would kind of plan it out. They did some capacity planning, which helped them with getting better at forecasting, which was useful for talking to management. Management started feeling way better about predictability on the team, which was great. And we slowly got them to think about story points versus task estimates and the benefit of talking in size rather than in dates and times. And that all kind of came out. And this is the part where I started injecting a little bit more coaching, because at this point they had built up so much of a muscle for retrospectives and change that I didn't feel like I was telling them what to do as much as giving them options. And they were self-selecting the options they wanted. So I never said you should do story points ever. But I did talk about the benefits of story points and the disadvantages, and let them make up their own mind on how they wanted to move. Very slowly, they moved towards a formal sprint model of planning. And today, their planning process looks exactly like every other sprint planning you'd ever see. That's a good one. So now we have a fully formed Agile mindset, and we have our own version of the Scrum framework that they own. It's not Scrum in the sense that it's something that was imposed on them. It's Scrum in that we know why we're doing every step of the way. We made all of these decisions ourselves. They owned it. And so they defended it, and they supported it, and they built it up. And ever since then, they tackled these challenges more or less on their own with me supporting them. But they basically did this. I mean, they were able to deal with skill set deficiencies on the team, management issues, cultural challenges. They started, that was the beauty. They started recognizing what was a team problem versus what was an organizational problem, because they could see, because of their processes now, where the challenges were. And so they could work on them that way. And so I gave them strategies on how to work on those things. Could do a whole nother speech just on that one. Architectural issues and so on. So they did start to solve bigger problems. PI planning, since it was a safe, that particular organization was using SAFE. They were supposed to be a safe team. We started doing PI planning with the other teams in the department, and it was a mess. It was horrible. It was terrible, but it got better. Each one was better than the last. And by the time I left, they were running PIs that looked like what a safe PI is supposed to look like. So they got there, and they did it almost 100% by themselves. They kept thanking me, and I kept scratching my head going, "You're doing all the work." So where are they now? They have at least 2 functional Scrum teams. I think they have more now. They have an effective Scrum Master finally. They have a new person came in. The product owner was added. They did split the teams up finally and get that working. And they've created product owners for each one so that it wasn't one product owner across all of the teams. They do have a dedicated coach, I think, still, but it's an internal person now. They've addressed a lot of structural challenges along the way. I'm very proud of them. They've got a lot to accomplish still. They're not, they've got a long, long way to go, but Agile's a journey, and they're on the journey. Okay, so with that, and just a minute left, I want to give you a couple of key takeaways, and then we can talk about this. Number 1, I think of Agile as being common sense. It helps me relax into the process and not feel like I have to explain things and tell people everything. I think of it this way: when people have clear goals and mission, when they have metrics that they agree are important, and when management is supportive of them so they have a safe space, then Agile can kind of happen. You don't have to put a lot of process in place to get Agile to be successful. Not Agile mindset anyway. And you don't need formal training, but you certainly need respect and safety. And you need effective retrospectives. You need an engine for change. A good coach or role model really helps, of course. And you need to foster a culture of risk-taking and learning. If you can't create a risk-taking culture, you're never going to get where you're trying to go with Agile. So that has to be part of the culture you create. And if you see that that's a problem, that's the first thing you tackle. And that's what we did here. Be a servant leader, enable autonomy, talk the talk, walk the walk, listen to them, strengthen them as the speaker. Try not to be the loudest voice in the room. Try not to be doing most of the talking. Give them some powerful questions to answer, and then let them answer them. Build them up. Don't ever blame or judge. Those things will never help you. You got to be, it's sort of like being a parent. There's different kinds of parents out there, right? There's the parent who's criticizing the kid all the time. And then there's the parent who's always the coach and the cheerleader and the support. I remember listening to a famous baby doc. My daughter was first born. And what he said was, there'll be lots of people in your child's life that will tear them down. You need to be their biggest advocate. And so that's what I try to do for the teams, is be their biggest supporter. And then reflect before reacting. There is a lot of times in these processes where you feel frustrated. Oh my God, I know the answer. I can fix this. Don't. Use foresight, see the whole picture, think about what you really want. And here's what it comes down to. Do you want to be effective or efficient? The efficient parent spanks the child who's about to run into the street, and the child doesn't run into the street this time. The effective parent sits the child down and talks to them and helps them understand why it's important not to run into the street. And that's the child that doesn't run in anymore. And no, we're not dealing with children, but we are dealing with the idea that I can either do things to be efficient, just get it done. Here, I know the answer, I'll tell you the answer. Or effective, you figure it out and then you own the outcome. So this is about creating ownership. Final takeaway. Measurement is challenging, and I could literally spend another hour just on this one slide, but very quickly, you've got to measure things that matter to you. Those measurements need to motivate you towards a goal. Given these 4 dials on the screen right now, which one tells you your speed? Which one should you be looking at when you're trying to control your speed? If you don't know which one it is, guess what's going to happen? You're going to guess, and you're going to do the best you can, and you're probably going to end up getting a ticket. See, the problem is that there's always pressure to measure things because that's what you do, you measure. Measurement without purpose is not helpful. It's actually destructive. Measurement without action is not useful. So if you're going to measure things, ask yourself, what actions am I going to be able to take because I'm making this measurement? And if those actions align with what your goals are and your purpose, that's great. And finally, make sure your measurements are growth-oriented. They're designed to help you improve, not to help you be judged or compared to other people or rewarded or punished. When you create rewards and punishments around metrics, you will create bad behaviors in your team. I promise you that will happen. So try to make sure that all your measurements are growth oriented. And then finally, the typical impediments that you're going to deal with. All of these you can deal with through the process I just gave you, every single one of them. And they're really important. If your management is talking agile, but not walking agile, they are going to create huge impediments to success. I've talked to so many companies say, oh, we're agile. But when you get down to it, they don't practice it. They don't practice autonomy is another problem. Not just agile, but also just the idea of autonomy. They have a hard time letting go and letting go of control. So these are just some things to think about that you can deal with. But all of these challenges here, you can deal with using the process I just laid out. All right. And with that, I'd love to open it up to questions.
Scott, that was awesome. And we have a whole bunch of questions. Keshav was asking, what does the coach do the Scrum Master does not?
A Scrum Master is a form of coach. That is part of their job. They are an advocate and an evangelist for Scrum. One of the differences I find just from doing this a lot is that Scrum Masters are Scrum oriented. Their job is to make Scrum work well. The coach's job is to make business outcomes. And they're not the same thing. For instance, I can look at a team and say, shouldn't be a Scrum team. Don't need Scrum. And I have no problem with that. Scrum isn't in my name. I don't care about Scrum. I care about outcomes. And so sometimes Scrum's the answer and sometimes it's not. So that's one very strong distinction. But I will say that coaches support the team less hands-on. If they're, well, the kind of coaching I do, it's a lot more observation and less participation. The Scrum Master is a formal part of the team. And so they really are part of the team, where I'm really kind of above the team and I'm there to support the team, but I'm not in the team. I hope that makes sense. Does that answer the question?
Next one. Alexandra wants to know, what was the reason that SAFe was used for an agile implementation?
Full disclosure, I'm certified in SAFe. I'm not a huge proponent of it. I definitely don't jump to it. This is an organization that chose SAFe for the same reasons most large organizations do. It creates a command and control structure around Scrum. It creates a way for the management to continue to control and observe and watch and flow a Scrum process down to the Scrum teams. There's nothing wrong with that if it's done well. Oftentimes it's not implemented well. And in this case, it wasn't implemented well, by the way. But when it is, it can be very powerful. So it depends on how well it's implemented. And in this case, it really wasn't. But they needed some way to say, how do we measure teams? How do we create standardization across teams? Doesn't sound very agile to me, does it?
But very common. Andrea asked, what's the difference between a product owner and a product manager in your context?
Great question. We built a RACI, a responsibilities chart that shows kind of what a product owner does and what a product manager does. There's some overlap, but the product owner is really focused on the team. And the product manager has a much larger and broader outlook. For instance, one thing that the product manager thinks a lot about is the ROI of the work they're doing. And they're doing a lot more market competition, competitive analysis, things like that. They're a lot more focused on the externals as well as the internals. So they have a larger, broader view of the world, and they're usually not the point person for the team itself. Typically, in a smaller company, they could be the same person.
Next question again, Alexandra. If the company did not allow you to train them more formally, like in a classroom, how did you communicate to them in what Agile means and the framework that they were adopting and reasons why?
Yeah, I didn't. What I did is ask them powerful questions and let them figure it out. This is what I was trying to say before. I look at Agile as being common sense. Therefore, I don't need to tell you. I need to help you experience it, and then you do it. Just as an aside, I do agility training with dogs. And one of the things when you're teaching dogs is that you do this process called shaping, where if you want to teach a dog a very difficult technique with lots of steps to it, jumping through a hoop or something like that, you don't teach them to jump through the hoop and say, jump through the hoop. What you do is you teach them a series of steps. And when they're doing all the steps in line correctly, you give it a name. It's called shaping. And so once they figure the whole thing out, you put a name to it. So I didn't say we're doing retrospectives or we're doing sprint planning or whatever. I just incrementally asked them, how do you want to solve this problem that you see? And they would come up with a solution. And when they came up with a solution that was effective, I'd give it a name at that point. So, let's call that sprint planning. And that's how we did it. little by little.
Which is a great segue to the next question, because Alex asked, within the retro, what if something came up that was insurmountable?
There's no such thing. What there is the idea that we can't do it in one big chunk, but we're agile. I really stress the idea of the 15% solution, the idea of how can we take one step forward? Because when you take one step forward, you learn. And from that learning, you can take another step forward. Let me give you an example that I think you might be getting to. A lot of times they'll say things like, oh, that's just the way the company is. Whatever the process is, whatever the impediment is, oh, that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about it. You'll hear those things. So what I'll ask them is, have you actually tried to quantify the problem and how much impact it's having on your team? No. So what I always tell people is, when you have a feeling, what data is driving that feeling? And if you don't have that data, collect that data first. When you go to your manager and say, I feel this way, and your manager says, well, I feel that way, guess who wins that argument almost every time, right? That power dynamic is not in your favor ever. However, if you go to your manager who is a business person and you show them data that shows how much money they're losing, time they're losing, opportunity they're losing, and you can quantify it, then you're dealing with facts. And when you bring facts to a rational person, typically you're going to get a rational response. That doesn't mean they're always going to agree with you, but now you're having the right conversation. And most of the time that leads to a much better outcome, or at least a better shared understanding. And so, yes, you can't do everything you ever want to do, but pretty much you can move forward and take small steps. And that's what I encourage.
Reminds me a lot of the old Jim Barksdale quote, if we have data, let's go with the data. If all we have is opinion, let's go with mine. Scott, that was awesome. Totally fantastic. Really looking forward to the recording and making that available to everyone else. And thank you so much for sacrificing your morning here. That was highly appreciated.
I hope you all enjoyed it. I love doing this stuff. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'm happy to help.
Awesome. Scott, thank you so much.
Thanks, Devin. Have a great day.